which many of the dinosaurs did have 3 claws, like the theropods. So I believe they're what many people have called dragons, or have been translated to the word dragon, really reflect a human experience, widespread among almost all cultures, of having witnessed at some point in history very, very large, very frightening reptiles.
You know, the dragon legends, the stories of these dragons, they always talk about these huge reptilian beasts with fierce teeth and prickly spines, and they just sound so much like dinosaurs.
It's like knowing about Julius Caesar or Alexander the Great. We have to rely on historical records of these things, because you can't scientifically prove that Julius Caesar existed. It's always a matter of history. And I think dragons, a lot of that will be widespread historical writings of such creatures, including, for instance, the Chinese calendar, where you have 12 animals. One of them is a dragon. I was born on the year of a dragon, but all the animals are treated as equally real. So it does seem like the Chinese people did see a creature we would now call a dragon, which they called the Long.
Actually, there are a lot of legends of dragons being used for breeding. The Chinese have stories about breeding dragons. There are artifacts that show people riding these things.
It's quite remarkable that, to many people, that Australian Aboriginal people actually have accounts of their ancestors having encountered creatures that today, by any reckoning, you'd describe as being dinosaurs on the basis of scientists' reconstructions from fossils. On a personal level, I recall meeting a university researcher in the Northern Territory in Darwin after giving a presentation there a couple of years ago. And she said that she'd been working with the local Larrakia Aboriginal people, and they had a word for a fierce creature that lived in the local swamps there that used to terrorise the first Aboriginal people who'd come to that area via canoes from another country far away. And when this university researcher said to them, "Oh, that word obviously means crocodile," the Larrakia people responded, "No, we've got a different word for crocodile. This other creature, in fact, looks very similar to some of your dinosaurs in your children's book about dinosaurs."
There is an Indian legend called the Thunderbirds. And according to legend, these huge bird-like creatures would fly, and they would actually be able to bring thunder with them. And at first that seems sensational. But if you start looking at the evidence, things change just a little bit. Because what is in the Black Hills in South Dakota, the legend is that these giant thunderbirds would actually fly to the top of the Black Hills, and they would like nest there. Now what is fascinating is that scientists have long believed that those kind of gigantic creatures needed strong winds to propel them to high heights. And so in the West, where you have these gigantic thunderstorms, it is really postulated these gigantic pteranodons would catch thermal updrafts of these storms that would lift them to the top of places like the Black Hills. So from an Indian's perspective that is trying to pull meaning from the things in nature, they would look at these what they would call thunderbirds and go, wow, they are bringing thunder. But it's actually what's really happening is that it's the thunderstorms that are actually bringing the pteranodons.
This is taken from a book named After the Flood, where he recounts, "Dinosaurs in the form of flying reptiles were a feature of Welsh life until surprisingly recent times. As late as the beginning of the present century, elderly folk at Penllyn in Glamorgan used to tell of a colony of winged serpents that lived in the woods around Penllyn Castle. As Mary Trevelyan tells us, the woods around Penllyn Castle, Glamorgan, had the reputation of being frequented by winged serpents, and these were the terror of old and young alike. An aged inhabitant of Penllyn, who died a few years ago, said that in his boyhood the winged serpents were described as very beautiful. He said it was no old story invented to frighten children, but a real fact. His father and uncle had killed some of them, for they were as bad as foxes for poultry. The old man attributed the extinction of the winged serpents to the fact that they were terrors in the farmyards and coverts." This is a pteranodon, an example of one. And by the way, not all of them were huge with big long wings. And in Beowulf, it describes 2 different kinds. One which had massive, huge wings, which we know existed from fossils, 30-foot and more wingspan. But there's another kind of winged serpent that was smaller, but it was just as much a pest, not just in Beowulf, but in England and to the North American Indians and Central American Indians, etc.
Interestingly, there's a Scandinavian king called Beowulf, and there's a very famous poem about his exploits. And if you read about his description of this big beast that he killed because it was terrorizing the villagers, it's a very accurate description of a Tyrannosaurus Rex.
Most people say Beowulf is entirely mythical because there's all these monsters in it. But if you read Beowulf, the poem, it doesn't say fairies and magic elves. It's talking about the Grendel. It's talking about a bipedal monster with giant mouth and big teeth that ate people, just like we might imagine a pteropod dinosaur might do.
In the Agat National Park in Nebraska, there are these structures in the side of the rocks called Devil's Corkscrews. And for years, scientists thought that the plants or some sort of plant created these spiral structures that descend from the surface down about 6 feet. But it was not until they started excavating them that they found these little fossils of beavers at the bottom of them, and they found out that these beavers made these wild corkscrew lodges in the rock. And evolutionary timelines would put this beaver to be extinct about 30 million years ago. But the problem with that is that American Indians know full well what those corkscrews were. And if you would have asked a Lakota Indian, they would have told you they were beaver lodges.
My point with Haast's eagle is the Maoris tell a legend about a giant eagle. And it's easy for us to say, oh, giant eagle, pff, whatever. But it's been verified and it's published. It's the real deal. It was a giant eagle. So if they were right about the giant eagle, then perhaps peoples have been telling the truth in their legends of other creatures too.
Most people today accept that dinosaurs have become extinct, and even creationists who look at the accounts of apparent recent human dinosaurial contact would say, look, it does seem that dinosaurs are extinct. However, there are some tantalising accounts of sightings in very recent decades from various places around the world. In the Congo, for example, the local people there talk of a creature they call Mokele Mbembe. And when Westerners have gone in with drawings of African creatures and dinosaur handbooks, and they've pointed to pictures of, say, the hippopotamus or the rhino, the people have said, no, that's not Mokele Mbembe. And when shown a picture of a sauropod dinosaur in a dinosaur handbook, they've pointed to something like a small sauropod dinosaur. Another example comes to mind, the Lake Murray region of Papua New Guinea. There were people there out in a canoe, and as they looked under their canoe, they saw a large creature swim under the canoe that had what looked like triangular plates extending down its back and all the way down its long tail. And the people speak there of large nesting sites adjacent to the water's edge, which have been clearly left by a large creature.
If you only had one or two stories that sounded a bit similar to dinosaurs, you could see it as just a coincidence. But when you have this universal theme right across the globe, many different continents, many different cultures, and over a vast span of human history, then there's probably going to have to be some universal core truth there. In fact, the late Dr. Carl Sagan, one of the most well-known of all the world's evolutionists, took it so seriously that he actually wrote a book called The Dragons of Eden to try and answer this question as to how come there are so many different stories of dragons that are very similar to the dinosaurs when no one's ever seen a dinosaur. And the answer he came up with in his book was essentially that well, we evolved from reptiles, so part of our brain is a sort of a leftover of when we lived in the age of the reptiles, and so dragon legends are really, if you like, inherited memories from the age of reptiles. Now, there was an embarrassed silence from many of his evolutionary colleagues because, of course, there's no scientific credibility to the idea that memories are inherited. You know, that you might remember what some ancestor did when he was serving Cleopatra or something like that. But the importance of that little account was that one of the world's leading evolutionists took this issue so seriously that he tried to explain it, even though he didn't do a very good job. A much better explanation is that the Bible is right, that man and dinosaur did live together, and what we see are the somewhat corrupted legends, somewhat corrupted stories of a time when people and dinosaurs did really know each other.
Some people saw Danny coming. He was huge with scales and a long tail. They ran away screaming, "Dragon, dragon, run for your lives!" Danny yelled, "Come back!" But it just sounded like, "Roar!" This made everyone run faster. Stories about Danny's huge teeth and claws soon spread across the land.
If these really are stories based on memory, that means that at one point in time, man did see dinosaurs.
In National Bridges National Monument, Utah, there's actually some carvings, petroglyphs, done by the Indians that even an evolutionist in an evolutionary textbook says looks like a sauropod dinosaur. And we've actually had a team go out there, they've seen it, photographed it, did a wax cloth impression of it, and it just looks like a sauropod dinosaur. But of course the evolutionists would say, well no, it must be some mythical animal. Why? Because dinosaurs didn't live with people. Well, how do you know that? And so to me, that sort of evidence, when you look at your dragon legends, many of the descriptions of those dragons actually fit nicely what we would call dinosaurs. And many of your dragon carvings, for instance, that you see, dragon paintings around the world, they look like some of the dinosaurs that we would understand existed from the fossil record.
The exact date was 1186 AD. And it's a stone temple. It's in the Angkor Wat temple complex around Cambodia. And in a jungle area.
There's a number of stone carvings of things that are familiar to us today, along with Hindu and Buddhist mythology. And very distinctively, there's one that looks very much like a stegosaur, as reconstructed from fossils by scientists. And the question becomes, how did the people who carved that stone 800 years ago have carved so beautifully a stegosaur without having had any knowledge about what's in today's encyclopedias? And the clear conclusion is they were familiar with those creatures because they were alive at the same time.
Unless it was living, how could they get its anatomy correct? They had to see it in order to reproduce it correctly. And that's just one of over 80 instances around the world in every single continent where it's been found that humans and dinosaurs have coexisted because the humans have reproduced dinosaurs in one art form or another.
There's a cathedral in the UK, Carlisle Cathedral, which has been there a very long time. And one of the bishops buried there 600 years ago has, on the brass trimmings around his tomb, a number of engravings of animals, many of which are familiar to us today, but there's also some that look very much like sauropod dinosaurs. In fact, any 21st century child would immediately recognise them as being sauropod dinosaurs. And so when we think about the evolutionary view that says dinosaurs became extinct 65 million years ago, and then we look at these sauropod dinosaur engravings on this 600-year-old tomb, how did they get there?
The oldest artifact that we have, period, is an Egyptian slate that commemorates an Egyptian king. And Hierakonpolis slate is one of the names given to this artifact. And on one side it shows him grasping the head of his recently defeated foe and about to chop the head off. So it's a slate saying, look how great I am. And on the back, it's got some Egyptians with ropes around necks of two great sauropod looking, I mean, they look just like a children's book with a Apatosaurus on it or something, necks intertwined. And we have this motif repeated on two different, totally different places, separated by hundreds of years.
Obviously, if there are engravings of sauropod dinosaurs which are hundreds of years old, prior to any scientists' reconstructions of fossils, the only way that we could say that they could have done it so intelligently was if they had viewed the creatures for themselves, or at least had access to sketches or drawings or descriptions made by eyewitnesses of those creatures at around that time.
As some people look at the fossil record, as some people look at evidence that humans and dinosaurs lived at the same time, they see pictures, they see drawings, they see carvings, they see work in metal and weaving of individuals that have actually reproduced dinosaurs. And the American Indian is one of those groups that has done that, especially in paintings and drawings.
Adrienne Mayor, first of all, if we talk about what she's done on this, I think we ought to give her credit for doing a tremendous amount of research. And when I say data, I mean legend after legend after legend after legend of descriptions of the same kinds of creatures that were giant, terrible lizards. There were thunderbirds, there were water monsters given the same description from tribe after tribe after tribe across North America, but even in South America and Central America. We've got this robust, legendary lore, complete with descriptions of habitat, descriptions of habit, anatomical attributes. Where did all this come from?
And some people say, well, we don't want to have the Indian living at the dinosaur, so the Indian went ahead and found bones and then went ahead and assembled those bones into the proper shape and then put the musculature and the skin on the bones, and then based upon what they came up with, they then did a drawing showing what this dinosaur or reptile would look like in life. Now, with all due respect to the skills of the American Indian, and there are a great many of them, I honestly don't know if paleontology hundreds of years ago was one of them.
Well, the very fact that we have these artifacts begs the question, how did they know to draw these? In other words, if they're mythological, how is it that they all drew the same exact myth, and yet they're separated through distant time as well as distant geography? And the question, it's a tough one to answer because it depends on your worldview. And if you back up and think, if I just go based on the data, then it seems to suggest on its surface that these people, real live people at some point, encountered creatures that looked like this.
I've been informed that in a cave in France there's a mammoth seemingly engaged with or in combat with a dinosaur. Now, if that's so, that's very significant because even though mammoths are extinct, everybody accepts that mammoths and humans live together because you sometimes find spear points of human spears in mammoth fossils or mammoth skeletal remains in caves. And of course there are many drawings of mammoths by people and everybody agrees they're mammoths. So if mammoths and humans are together and you see a picture of a mammoth and a dinosaur together, then obviously dinosaurs and humans were together too, which of course evolutionists say is impossible.
American Indians had this legend. They called this creature the grandfather of the buffalo. And you know, that's an interesting description because you're like, okay, what would a grandfather buffalo look like? Obviously it would have long hair, it would look like a buffalo, but they said it was much, much, much bigger. Well, there was a waterfall found in Minneapolis, and underneath this waterfall was this tusks of a mammoth. And Indians actually pointed to that spot and said that's where the grandfather of the buffalo lived. And what's fascinating is if they were able to understand the flesh, they were understand the hairy characteristics of this mammoth, there was only one way they could have known that, is if they would have actually seen the creature.
And once again we see that the evolutionary time frame, that the layers in the rocks represent millions of years, comes to grief on things like this, which show that people, dinosaurs and mammoths and many creatures that we're familiar with today all lived at the same time.
First of all, what we have to understand now, it was not until the year 1822 when Gideon Mantle and his wife found the iguanodon tooth. And that was supposedly the absolute beginning of our understanding of dinosaurs. And modern academia will tell you that is when we discovered them. Well, the problem with that is that we have all these images of ancient people groups that had intimate knowledge of dinosaurs. They drew them on vases, they were on pottery, and if it is true that they had no knowledge of dinosaurs, then where in the world did all those images come from?
The people went to the police and demanded that something be done. The police gathered their weapons and their bravest officers and went off to see what they could find. Danny was terrified. He just wanted to find a friend. He was very old and had looked everywhere but couldn't find anyone else like him. It was like he was the last dragon on Earth.
2 days before his crucifixion, Jesus Christ led his disciples through the streets of Jerusalem toward one of the ancient world's most magnificent buildings, the Jewish temple, reconstructed by the king Herod the Great. Here, surrounded by walls of marble and gold, 15 stories high, the disciples spoke excitedly about the splendor of Israel's most sacred structure.
Look, teacher, what massive stones, what magnificent buildings. There can be nothing in the entire world as beautiful as this holy place.
Unmoved by their enthusiasm, Christ stunned the 12 with a chilling prophecy.
Do you see these great buildings? I tell you, not one stone here shall be left upon another that shall not be thrown down.
Nearly 40 years later, the Roman army brutally suppressed a Jewish rebellion by setting fire to the temple and its surrounding walls. Stone by stone, the Romans pried apart each marble block, then threw them into the streets below. In this act of violence, Christ's prophecy was fulfilled to the smallest detail. Yet Jesus' prediction of the temple's impending destruction was only the beginning of all he was about to reveal concerning the future. Later that afternoon, he led his disciples outside Jerusalem's walls toward the summit of the Mount of Olives. There, in the gathering twilight, as Jesus looked out over the city, Peter and John approached him, fearing that if the temple was destroyed, the end of the world would soon follow. Troubled and confused, they asked, "Lord, when will these things be? And what will be the sign of your coming and the end of the age?" Once again, Christ answered with the full power of prophetic truth, as he described for his disciples and every generation that would follow the extraordinary signs and events that will one day culminate in the end of human history.
The teachings of Jesus on the Mount of Olives are absolutely essential to any understanding of future events and end times chronology for a couple of reasons. It's Jesus speaking, first of all, and secondly, it's in response to a specific question and set of questions such as, what are the signs of your return and of the end of the age? And it's the only time that Jesus really took the time to lay out a chronology, detail by detail and sequence by sequence, for us to understand.
He knows the end from the beginning. He's God, and on him the Spirit, the Bible says, rested without measure. Now, the Holy Spirit rested on all the prophets, but I think we can depend on the words of Jesus in a special category. And what he did is he gave us an outline on which all other prophecy must rest.
Christ's description of the end times is now recorded in the Gospels of Matthew, Mark, and Luke. In each of these accounts, Jesus foretells the incredible scenario that will unfold during the final chapters of the earth's history.
Listen to my words. There will be great distress, unequaled from the beginning of the world until now, and never to be equaled again. If those days had not been cut short, no one would survive.
Christ's prophetic teachings read like a horror story of natural disasters, spiritual deception, famine, war, and death, the likes of which the world has never known. For nearly 2,000 years, these words have sparked both fear and fascination as 50 generations have anticipated their fulfillment. Today, many believe we are living in the final generation. Yet there is no way to be certain, for an aura of mystery, daily course of human existence throughout the world in a harmony that cannot be ignored. Let us look now to the future, as seen through the eyes of Jesus and the prophets he inspired. For in their words, we will discover important clues to understanding all that is to come.
Prophecy itself is God's way of reminding us that He alone knows the future, and therefore He alone can tell the future. The signs in prophecy are indications to remind us that if you see these things begin to happen, then know that the rest of the fulfillment is close behind.
If we are indeed living on the verge of prophetic fulfillment, then it would seem our need for insight beyond mere human speculation has never been greater. 2,000 years ago, Christ began his discourse on the future by identifying for us specific signs that he said would herald the beginning of the end of time.
Watch out that no one deceives you, for many will come in my name, claiming, I am the Christ, and will deceive many.
In Matthew 24, Jesus warned, in answering the disciples' question, he warned about 11 times, beware of false teachers and false Christs and false messiahs.
As we have moved into the last 150 years, false prophets, false cults, false religions have just exploded. There are numerous cult groups today that are growing into the millions of followers.
Spiritual deception has always played a significant role in the human drama, for in every generation, many have come as messengers of light, only to lead their devoted followers into spiritual darkness. In recent years, some of these false Christs have become household names. Jim Jones and the Tragedy of Guyana. Today, the prospect of all-out war in the Middle East. Whether or not our generation is living through the specific wars and rumors of wars Christ foresaw is open to speculation. But amidst the anxiety and bloodshed, there is little doubt that modern weapons of destruction, coupled with ever-mounting political tensions, represent the volatile formula that could potentially lead to the end of civilization as we know it.
There will be great earthquakes, famines, and pestilences in various places. All these are the beginning of birth pains.
Like the specter of escalating warfare, Jesus said that a progression of devastating natural disasters will also underscore the approach of the last days. Again, our world is well acquainted with these fears. World relief agencies estimate that as many as 1/3 of the Earth's 6 billion people are victims of